Really a pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation, the opportunity to have a chance to talk with you about some reflections. So I will just say that first slide does look a little bit different than it does on my laptop. I will report back to McMaster that this is their new Brighter World template, their branding template. So I will say that they might want to have a think about that.
You're on camera up there just so that you know there's a lot of other people interested.
Okay, terrific. So my plan is to hopefully stick to no more than half an hour, 30 to 35 talks. I really do want to give people an opportunity to ask questions, to have a bit more of a discussion. I understand that people online will be able to submit questions, which is terrific. I also, recognize that there may be quite a range of people in terms of their roles, their interests, experiences. So try to hit the right level and just to really get us started. So with respect to my approach to this talk, because I do give talks like these a fair bit and have done so over a number of years, I like to give you a sense of who I am, right, and where I'm reflecting from, because I think, this field is quite a multidisciplinary field, people coming into it from a variety of different backgrounds. So I think it is important to set the stage and have you have a bit of a sense of who I am. So I am now someone who's been in the health research field as a faculty member at McMaster University for 20 years. And I'm a social scientist by training, and my home discipline, if I had one, in political science isn't, a perfect home that I would say is mine, but it's probably the closest if I had to identify myself. So I'm really an interdisciplinary researcher, but social scientist, health services researcher, qualitative methods in particular, but political science would be my home discipline. And I think that's actually quite important and quite relevant to this field because, the idea of the politics of patient engagement or public participation, there's quite a lot of that in it. So I think being a political scientist, having that background is quite helpful. I've been doing quite a bit of conceptual, theoretical, and empirical work in this field long before, sport, for sure, long before patient-oriented research. In fact, long before even, the kind of interest in patient engagement and health system decision-making and health policy-making. So really, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Also doing a lot of work, really, in terms of my empirical work, primarily around the design, implementation, and evaluation of a variety of public engagement approaches. And I often think of them as methods, right? And I know you have a methods cluster here, and so there may be some interest in thinking about this idea of the methodology of patient engagement. And if I were to kind of categorize myself in terms of what kinds of methods, I would say the emphasis has very much been on citizen deliberation work and that idea of trying to elicit values, citizen values in particular, towards a range of policy issues, whether that be priority setting and planning. We have done work in the health technology assessment field, particularly in cancer screening and drug funding. I do my work at the regional and provincial level. And so because this is the BC support unit, because we're talking about patient-oriented research, or that's the interest of many folks around the table here, I will say that I am someone who's come more recently to look at my field, to apply it to the area of health research. And I think that maybe has some strengths, some positive things about that, but perhaps also recognizing some limitations as well. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do now was to just give you very quick 3 slides to kind of, again, set the scene. I think it's, especially someone like me who's been in this field for quite some time, important to give a bit of a history, give us a sense of, how we got to where we are now. I know the theme and are we there yet is something that I will come back to over and over again. So where really have we come from to where we are now? I talk about 3 eras. I talk about the public consultation era. This is broadly over 3 decades, very much a focus on citizens and publics as opposed to patients, and very much around the representation on planning bodies, in the design of health services, around priority setting and resource allocation. And that was very much how I entered the field A lot of work going on in the UK at the time as I was starting to become interested in this area. However, there certainly was this kind of notion of patient involvement in health research, but it was very kind of early stages, again, much more around setting priorities for research, what I think is quite interesting, some of the guidelines development work that was beginning to occur. So it wasn't as if we were not talking about patients at all, but I think the broader kind of description of the era for me would be more of a broader public consultation era. Next slide. And then we move from that more, and often people talk about more passive or unidirectional approach to public consultation, to one where we're much more actively engaging with patients or public, right, that shift. And I think there was a very definite shift. Again, as someone who was in the field and a student of all of this at the time, I tend to think about around the late 1990s, in fact, where we started to actually see people use different terminology. We moved away from the term consultation. It was almost considered a bad thing, a negative, and I actually will come back to that because I don't agree with that. But we are starting to, at this time, think about it, engagement as the way we want to talk about our interactions with publics, with patients, et cetera. And a number of examples, and so those of you who are, a little bit older, closer to my age, may remember citizen engagement, heavy-duty emphasis on citizen engagement in health system reform. This is the Romano Commission in the early 2000s. A number of institutionalized citizen engagement bodies coming about, obviously, NICE in the UK, led the way and was very much inspiration, really, and catalyst for some of the similar bodies that have been established in Canada. As well, important to recognize that the patient safety and quality improvement agenda movement really was taking off at this point. So lots of different things happening around the same time. Next slide, please. And that takes us into to our, what I consider our kind of third or present era, which is very much the patient engagement, patient partnership era. And I like to use this cover of the BMJ to signal that let the patient revolution begin. So, lots of attention worldwide to involving, to engaging, to partnering, right? Again, lots of different words being used to describe this phenomenon, and across a variety of domains, right, within the health system, whether we're talking about quality improvement, planning and policy making, or even at the governance level. Again, HTA, lots of attention there, and of course, health research. And I actually think this is really important, the fact that there has been so much energy, attention, movement in all of these domains, but they are in slightly different stages. And I actually will come back to this at the end. I actually think we could do a much better job of leveraging all of the expertise and experience that actually is in place in each of these domains. We tend to keep ourselves in our own area in health research or health technology assessment, et cetera. As someone who's kind of crossed most of those boundaries, I see a lot of potential for learning from the different domains. Next slide. So, and these are just a few examples, right, of the commitments. And I think this is where the kind of a policy analyst or policy researcher and someone coming from more of a social science and political science background in particular, this is important to pay attention to, right, these formal commitments. So we see the example on the left of the Saskatchewan Commission looking, and again, the labeling for patient safe, this is their Patients First review. In Ontario, we had about to change legislation titled Patients First. So all of this labeling, right, and signaling that's going on that patients matter and patients are at the core. Next slide, please. And then a few more examples here, and those are more on in the health system, health policy side. And then top left is Health Quality Ontario's commitment to engaging patients in their quality improvement efforts, which many of you may be familiar with. The bottom left is interesting. This has just come out. This is a patient declaration of values that the ministers, this is in Ontario, the ministers' PFAC, the Patient Family Advisory Council, has just announced. And also in our new, things are moving very rapidly in Ontario, and our new proposed legislation that will be moving through the legislature has actually identified the PFAC as a standing body. So again, really pretty significant commitment at the very early stages. And then on the right is the example of CADIS, which has recently put out a call for people to step forward for their newly formed or forming patients and community advisory council. So a lot of what I would call institutionalized mechanisms to actually bring patients and family members, caregivers into the next slide, please. And then, of course, on the health research side, we have SPORE on the right. Now, I think we're now at 7 years or 8 years in, 2011. The last one to come on board, so in the middle, Corey, which many of you may be familiar with, and then, of course, the NIHR and Involve, which has really been around for a much longer period of time, is not really in this latest kind of 10-year period of time that I've discussed, actually predates all of these by several decades. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to set the scene with some of those kind of commitments, some of those public announcements, and understand kind of where we've come from. And so the title for the talk was "Are We There Yet?" And this was, partly me saying, okay, Sterling wants a title, and it's a few weeks away, and I have no idea what I'm going to talk about, so let's keep it as broad as we possibly can, and let it give me some scope. And I was traveling out to BC, and hopefully having some time to travel and see some of your beautiful parts of the province, so I thought it made sense. And of course, as I started thinking about it, oh wow, there's so many different ways I could go with this, and many questions, and Sterling and I had our back and forth, are we there yet? Usually, we're answering those questions because it's our kids who've been asking, are we there yet, right on the trip. So I decided to focus on these 5 questions. I had actually probably double the number. I had things like, are we lost? What's the road to that? What's on the way? Many other things I could have done, so I'm sticking with these. But certainly in the discussion, we can pick up on those other points if you like. Next slide, please. All right, so in terms of where do we want to go, first question, I was saying to Sterling earlier, I've been have these core kind of concept slides that I kind of trot out every time I do this kind of talk, and I always remind myself, maybe I don't need this, maybe we're beyond, and I actually feel like it's still relevant, so I'm going to walk you through this. So, of course, and many of you, this will be very obvious, but not a bad idea to maybe even remind ourselves or to refresh ourselves about why, some of these key concepts. So who is it, right? The who, the what, and the why, or what I typically have people think about, right? Very, very carefully. So who are we engaging or partnering with? Who are the people we're trying to do this thing with? What do we mean by it? And what are our goals? And I think it's important to recognize, of course, that we mean different things, right? Different publics, different patients, in many different roles, and for very, very different purposes. Next slide, please. So with respect to the who, again, this list of many different ways we might think about, talk about, construct publics or patients. And of course, people are in different roles at different times for different reasons, right? And so we may think of ourselves as citizens at one point. We could also be, of course, service users. We could be advocates. So again, this is where the political scientist in me really, finds this fascinating, absolutely fascinating, to really unpack, who is it we're interested in engaging with, who then wants to be engaged, whether anyone's asking them to be or not, and who actually is engaged, who actually is there getting involved and contributing. And I think there's, we could have a full session just on that slide alone. Next one, please. And in terms of the what, there are lots of different engagement frameworks, spectrum and continuum, all of kinds of different things. I kind of like this one. It's a bit of an odd looking thing with these spheres and arrows and all of the like. But it's something that the continuum that Health Canada produced now coming on to 20 years. And they've actually come out with a new one in the last few years, and I don't like it at all. So I'm sticking with the original. We can talk about that new one. It's very hierarchical. I like this one because it doesn't judge that one, particular place you are along the continuum is more appropriate than another. It just lays it out. Here are the different ways we may be looking at in involving publics and or patients, whether we're informing, educating, trying to that one-way approach of gathering information, discussing, engaging, and of course, partnering. So I think it captures a lot in a very efficient way. And the directions of the arrows, you spend a little bit of time on that, you can really see that it, I think, captures what each of those stages is attempting to achieve. Next slide, please. And then with respect to the goals, so what are our goals for engagement and partnership? And importantly, whose goals are they, right? Because anyone around this table may have a particular set of goals, the support unit may have goals, but your patient partners may have different goals. They may have similar ones. And actually working through that and understanding whose goals are being put forward and why is a really, really important part of this work. And so I talk about these four different categories, and people can use different labels to describe them, but instrumental or kind of quality-oriented goals. This is, ultimately, and I think probably many people around this table and on the webinar would say, we're trying to promote, we're trying to do things better. We're trying to promote higher quality research, ultimately improved health outcomes. This is very much along the line of SCORE's mandate. But if you're on the health system, health policy side, of course, improving quality of care and health outcomes may be your goals. I think these other three sets of goals are also extremely important to consider in the mix, right? This idea of democratic or legitimacy goals, right? A lot of process-oriented aspects to patient and public engagement. So it's not just about the outcome, what comes out of it, but it's actually the process of ensuring that we have good, strong decision-making processes in place that are inclusive, legitimate, accountable, et cetera. The developmental goals, I think, often, well, maybe not often, I would say prior to the last number of years, they have not been given a whole lot of attention. I think there's a lot more attention to capacity building now, and this idea of capacity, right, is people, by virtue of their involvement or their partnering or whatever they're doing, have all kinds of skills and competencies and things that they can take to other domains of their lives. And I actually think that's a really important goal to be thinking about. Perhaps it's not necessarily the primary one, but certainly often one that I've seen come through in people who I've been involved in engagement projects with, where they come out and say, you know what, I'm now so equipped to do so many other things, and how can I do more than just what I'm doing with respect to this particular project? And of course, in some people's minds, this is rights driven. This is the ethics goal. This is a right. We have a right to do this. We expect to be asked to come to the table, to partner, and I think that drives a lot of people's motivations as well. And so, as you can see, these goals aren't necessarily always compatible, right? There are conflicts between them, and we need to keep those in sight. Next slide, please. So how do we get there? And in particular, can the research evidence help us, or how can it help us? There has been a tremendous really an explosion of literature in this field, even in the last couple of years, 5 years, 10 years, just a tremendous amount of work. What I try to look for is, where are the key contributions that are really going to move us forward in a few areas. What I've done is not trying to distill, do any kind of, here's a review of reviews, all of that, but just a few kind of reflections from me having been in this field for a long time. Next slide. So the three key points I often make, and I think they still stand or hold today. And I would say there's some interesting things happening now on the science side that I'll come to in a minute. But I would say that we are seeing, definitely, we have been seeing much more of a focus on the doing of engagement than the assessing. Makes sense, right? You're not in a position to do the evaluation, the assessment work until you start having some practice. But that often people, the argument could be, why are we even doing this if we don't have the evidence to support it? And those arguments are being made, right, quite routinely. We are in this realm with all of the slides I showed you earlier about how much activity is just going on for political reasons. Things are just happening. Patient engagement is happening. Partnering is happening. People are doing it, whether we have the science to support it or not. And again, perhaps this is the rights-based argument, the goals piece that I just mentioned. So we have to look at this in the political context. I would say that, but I would, put a caveat around that this is changing. I would say there's a lot more attention being paid. And I actually think SCORE and the fact that the health research community is getting so involved in this, they're asking some really tough questions, saying, where is the evidence? We need to start to do some work that's much more scientifically robust. And I think that's quite exciting, and I'm going to come back to that. I would say that, again, until recently, we've had a lot of very rich practice stories. As a primarily qualitative researcher, I want to advocacy, defend the fact that you can actually do very, very good, strong, robust, qualitative work and have very specific reasons for doing that. But typically, of course, with this type of research, we're seeing results that yield very context-specific benefits, right, or outcomes or understandings, right, for whether it's for specific populations or specific diseases, conditions, or types of research. So obviously, there's some very strong work going on, but limitations in terms of how we can take that and use it in a more generalizable way. I think for me, this third point is the one I'm most concerned about. The weak evidence base about methods and impact. I actually spoke very briefly with Tom about this yesterday, Tom Noseworthy, and he's like, where's the evidence base? There's nothing out there. And this has been a weakness. And again, I go back to, well, we have to think about how this field has actually grown and evolved and emerged, and again, the politics that are at play. What I'm most concerned about is the lack of conceptual clarity about the who, the how, the why. That's why every time I go out and talk, I try to help with this conceptual clarity. The small scale, studies that are being conducted, again, limited follow-up, few comparisons. There's just, most people who are doing this work are doing it more on the practice side, and they don't have the time, the resources, the capacity to do the other work that we'd like to see happen. So I actually think this is I was quite excited yesterday in the methods cluster meeting to hear that this is something that the PCD support unit's really interested in. Next slide. And so I'm going to take you through 4 examples of recent systematic review. So again, not only is just individual studies coming out into the literature day by day, but actually lots of systematic reviews on a whole host of different topics. And again, remember, I'm covering not just health research, but actually health system, decision making, et cetera. So this is an example of one really interesting, I think, that was just published in the BMJ, which is looking very specifically at effects of patient public involvement on clinical trial enrollment and retention, because of course that's one of the assumptions, right, the hypotheses that this will help. So very narrow, right? That's fine. And so the finding that indeed PPI does improve rates of enrollment in clinical trials. The strongest effect being, and this won't be a surprise, but I think the fact that it's been actually confirmed, those when people with lived experience of the particular condition studies are involved. So this is the support for patient partners, right? This patient partnership with those with lived experience actually contributing to improved enrollment. I think it's important to recognize modest effect size was found, and that it was very important that it was the type of approach that was used. So it isn't the case that you used any particular type of involvement approach that would have a positive. What I think again underlined is most important to me is the mechanism through which the effect occurred are still unknown. So it's that black box. We still don't know what's going on inside. We kind of have these helpful hints, and the nice quote here that future research needs to assess, right, this idea of which types of PPI work best in a particular context. And I could actually pull out, I've got 5 of those very similar over decades. This is just an issue in this field. Next slide. So, and this happens, if you want to cut to the chase, go to the bottom, it's there again. The conceptual muddle, right, is one of the greatest barriers to truly integrating patient involvement into health services policy research. This is a systematic review led by Yvonne Lombard, and looking on the health services design delivery side and trying to get at this issue of strategies and contextual factors that enable optimal engagement. Interesting, I think, kind of teasing out of this idea of the level of engagement appears to influence outcomes with service redesign, and kind of picked apart this idea of, well, if you use consultative, more traditional consultative approach, that helps really with various discrete kinds of task-oriented things, tools, planning documents, et cetera. You don't need to go on into maybe heavy-duty partnering or co-design work, but that co-design and partnering work is very important when you're looking at contributing care processes, service delivery, governance. So I actually thought that was a really nice texturing or kind of unpacking of this idea of the level of engagement influencing service redesign in different ways. Next slide, please. The third one, I'm now kind of switching over to the evaluation tool side, work that I've been involved with a little bit over the last number of years. This is a systematic review led by Antoine. I was involved in this one as well. you know, basically trying to amass all of the different evaluation tools that have been put out over the last decade, showing quite a bit of activity, also showing, interestingly, some more and more involvement of patients and citizens in the process of developing the tools. This was a criticism of my own tool, someone who contributed to this field now 5 to 8 years ago. First question I had when I presented this work, were patients involved in their tool development? I had to say they were not involved directly in the tool development. They were involved with the piloting, and they certainly had a lot to help us with in the usability and piloting, but no. And I said, and to be fair, nobody was doing that at the time. So I was being a bit defensive for sure, but I thought appropriately. Now we're seeing patients involved in this process, which is great. But again, limitation, right? Very few impact measures. So we're doing well on the process side, you know, lots of good tools around this, but not on the impact side. And then when we have impacts, it's mostly self-reported and perceived impacts. And that's been a big challenge, something I'm working on in particular, because, you know, this idea of objective measures, it's not easy. And I know the support unit is wrestling with that as well. Next slide. And then the last one is just one that, to be honest, really quite a different review, trying to create a taxonomy of engagement metrics, again, with a very specific focus on impacts and outcomes. Did a tremendous work in terms of pulling together things, again, not just in the health field, but outside as well. And again, finding this, finding around key measures of impact beyond perception. And then I thought did a nice job of saying, here's a way forward, right? Here's how we might look at outcomes of patient engagement in the following ways. Look at it internally, externally, and then this idea of aggregate outcomes. And cost effectiveness would be great. I tried to do that many years ago, well over 10 years ago in a study, and we actually did a bit of work, but I don't see much of that out there, and I think it'd be interesting to take a look at it. Next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my reflective mode in the last kind of 5 to 10-ish minutes here. So what have we learned along the way? And I will say, perhaps this is very much personal reflection. What have I learned along the way, kind of watching all of this unfold, unravel, however you want to describe it. This is not easy, right? Obviously, if this were easy, if we had all the support units set up and everybody would have figured this out a long time ago. People like me wouldn't have had to stand up and say, yes, we still don't know. Julia, haven't you figured this out yet? No. So a couple of things on this. First, and this is something I've been spending a lot of time thinking about recently, is this notion of patients, right? And I had a slide on this around the concept piece. Patients are an extremely heterogeneous group. Their partners, family members, whomever we're speaking at, they bring different biographies, different histories. And biographies I used intentionally because I was involved in a study where we actually did a biographical analysis. We're trying to understand people who were on a committee and where they were coming from and how that drove their motivations, their aspirations, etc. I do think we have to think about this really carefully. Sure, we want to, for efficiency reasons, find patients, bring them in, partner with them, but we have to remember these are individuals with a whole host of experiences, of aspirations, of motivations, and of expectations. And I think we really need to spend some more time thinking about that. I know we do, all of us, I think, are trying to do our best, but it's to recognize that, this idea of a pool of patients. I really resisted that the first time I heard the pool of patients in this arena. I feel it's a very problematic term. So I don't have the answers, but goals of diversity, representativeness, this idea of the right patients, who do we want at the table, who's not here, who have we not represented. These are really challenging to operationalize, right? So I don't think we should be kind of too hard on ourselves for not getting it right or not feeling comfortable, but at the same time, we can't actually lose sight of this really important, after all, patient-oriented research. Patients are at the center of this, or the major focus of this. So really being much more intentional and clear and systematic in how we're thinking about patients. And just another one, what I see often, because I'm involved in evaluating the patient engagement work within the SPORE, one of the SPORE networks, I see a lot of good intention around the committees, the governance, PE, patients involved there, and then a bit of a drop-off at the project level. So you have lots of patients kind of on paper, and they're on committees, et cetera. And then when you get into, okay, well, what are they actually doing with respect to the research projects? A bit more of a bumpy experience of reporting out. Those two are, visuals there are just two different tweets and kind of tweet threads, actually, that have been generated. And again, Frank Gavin, who some of you may know, really thoughtful person in this area, and really is questioning this whole idea of patients as experts. What does that mean? What does expertise in patients mean? We are now labeling patients patient experts, right? They are experts in something. He's really challenging this, and he's in that category of, family member. And I think that's really healthy to have that kind of debate in this course. Next slide. So my second slide on what have we learned along the way. I struggled with this one because I really wanted something in here around it, but I'm not sure I quite articulated what's going on here. Obviously, many people are looking at, well, how do we figure out how to do this well, this idea of a comprehensive, high quality, the best practice in this area. If I were to say, and these are more my reflections, this idea of going all in versus superficial commitment. Again, it sounds so obvious, right? Of course you would not be superficial in your approach, but I think we are superficial in our approaches because maybe for all kinds of reasons, lack of expertise, capacity, maybe resourcing, and kind of pressure to get things done. So I would say, going all in or trying at least to achieve that is obviously the way I like to see things proceed. And I also see that people who are able to do this, sometimes it's because they're just deeply committed to this and always have been, and this is the way they've always done things. I mean, think about people working in the mental health field. I mean, there's a whole history of this, and long before initiatives like SPORE. So I often feel like sometimes, people who've been doing this really well for a long time don't get enough credit because all of a sudden we've got SPORE now, and everybody should be doing it a particular way. I would also say people have aha moments, right? People who are actually, frankly, quite skeptical will actually get involved in an initiative and be completely overwhelmed and transformed, really, by the experience and become very, very committed to this. I think clinicians are good examples where they have gotten involved in projects and seen that. And then, this idea of what does all in mean? Well, of course, we're talking about dedicated resources, capacity and expertise, full organizational commitment. There's a special issue, Longwood's Healthcare Quarterly, on engagement-capable environments. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that whole issue is dedicated to that. Fine. And then what to watch out for. So again, I have to say, this Twitter thread, this My Swan Song to patient engagement, generated a huge amount of attention. This is an individual who's okay, so I'm seeing nodding heads, so people are aware. And so again, you hear the term tokenistic, someone who actually read Ernstine's Ladder of Citizen Engagement, which was published in the 60s or 70s. Tokenism is the word used, and we are trying to get away from tokenistic approaches. So we still hear tokenism. We still hear tokenistic approaches a lot in this realm. So clearly, we haven't figured it all out. And virtue signaling, right? This is the idea that, and I think this is particularly organizations. I'm going to put it out there and say this is more in the health care delivery realm. A lot of, here's what we're doing, we've got it all in place, but maybe when you scratch the surface, there's not as much there. And what I think this Twitter thread signals is some loss of morale, burnout. I know certainly in discussing this issue with certain patient partners, very experienced ones, they've talked about burnout and people leaving the field. And so again, we have no sense of how big an issue this is, how the longevity of this, but I think something to be aware of. And then compensation. I don't go to any single meeting without it coming up. How do we do it? Do we do it? We need to do it. We must do it. And lots of challenges in figuring out how to do it. So I will just say we need to figure this out. And I heard what sounded like a crazy constraint on that in BC about who would pay and who wouldn't, and that being a challenge. I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. And of course, along with that is the whole issue of conflicts of interest, and they do need to be addressed as well. And I don't want to go off on quite a tangent on those two topics alone. The last slide might be at the end, yes. So last slide, where might we go from here? So tentative, where might we go? I think again, I'm a researcher, so this is me saying we've got to open up that black box and figure it out. I'm not convinced that we can't. Some people have said you can't. It's just too context specific, et cetera. I'm still of the mind that we can do better in terms of defining those core features, be quite a bit more clear and intentional about that. And this is, of course, to enable effectiveness research. This isn't just to support evaluation for evaluation's sake. It's actually to do better in this whole field. So I also think we can improve, as I said, our understanding of the patient advisor partner community across the country. You know, what are their characteristics? What kind of roles are they functioning in? What are their experiences, their challenges? Actually, of particular interest in this one right now. And then lastly, how do we provide the support to build up the science of engagement? So along the lines of what I heard a little bit about yesterday, both performative and summative purposes, and that idea of leveraging the expertise across the domains, I think that could be a tremendously valuable way forward. And I think in Canada, we're in a unique situation to be able to do that quite well, take the leadership on that. So I will end there.
Thank you very much, Julia. Would you mind zooming out? So we're just going to reconfigure things a little bit here so that you're seeing the entire room. For those of you who are tuned in real time, seeing the entire room so you can see who's here. Julia has very kindly come to our office to present to an in-person audience, as you're seeing on your monitors, as well as you who are at a distance. For those of you who are at a distance and not familiar with some of the players that Julia mentioned, Tom Noseworthy was mentioned, and he, of course, is the CEO of the Academic Health Science Network. Sterling Bryan was also mentioned. He is on camera right now, for those of you who are able to see video. He is the scientific director of the BC Support Unit. And Julia also mentioned the methods clusters, and those are a feature of the BC Support Unit. If you'd like to know more about those and you don't know about them, I encourage you to visit our website. So with that, I'm going to ask that if you have any questions or would like to participate in a dialogue, that you either unmute yourself to the right of your name in the participant panel. You'll see a little red icon that looks like a microphone that's been stroked through. Thank you, Aaron Mahalik. Or you can use the chat function, which is down in the bottom right corner of your monitor, and you can type in your question there, and we'll read those questions aloud so everyone can hear them. So, Aaron, given that you've unmuted yourself, I'm willing to bet that you're champing at the bit with a hot question.
Julia, that was such an amazing presentation. Thank you. And thanks for leaving so much time for questions as well. I'm really interested in your point around this idea of superficial versus all-in engagement, or what I term as kind of hit-and-run engagement, which is often, I think, a product of funding structures and systems, and the fact that often we don't have support for continuing patient engagement in between discrete funded projects or at the beginning of projects when we're conceptualizing what science needs to be done. So I'm just wondering if you have any reflections on initiatives or system level changes you've seen that can help support patient engagement around the fringes of kind of traditional scientific funding models that we could emulate or work with here in BC.
Great question. So something that came about, it was one of these interesting unintended outputs from a grant that I was involved in leading, and now about 10 years, yeah, really, I've been around for a long time. So this was a pan-Canadian team of, I would describe them engagement practitioners, so people working largely in health authorities and area at the time, regional health planning bodies. We were interested in doing some evaluation work across the country, but what came out was the incredible appetite for community practice, for the lack of the other word. They didn't want to call it that, but I think really that was it. They wanted to share their experiences, their challenges, what they were finding really working well, et cetera. And that is now the National Health Engagement Network that CFHI, the Canadian Foundation for Healthcare Improvement, moderates and supports. So I was really excited because that's now, I think they're possibly hundreds of people who've signed up for that network. I'm not sure how much of the health research community has started to connect with it, but it started with a very small group of people who, again, pretty much maybe 5 or 6 different provinces, who were finding that they were grappling with the same issues, challenges on the funding side, how do they keep the momentum up, how do they do things like evaluation. That's what catalyzed the evaluation tool work that I got involved in. They started to really just share a lot of good ideas and also challenges and desires, right, for how we could do this better if we only had this. And I think networks like that are extremely helpful. And they can kind of get you through difficult times, but also, I guess I said, catalyze some really terrific ideas. I don't know if that helps to answer, but if people aren't, I know there are a number of the health authorities in BC are actually connected, but I'm not sure about
Great.
Thanks
Thanks,
for that.
Erin. Thanks for the question. Do we have other questions from those participating via WebEx? You can unmute your microphone by clicking the red icon to the right of your name, or you can use the chat function. While we're waiting for questions coming from those who aren't in this room, I did see Dr. Brian furiously scribbling like he was an undergrad, and I suspect he might have a question.
Thank you very much, Pat.
You're very welcome, Dr. Brian.
So I'm going to go, I think this heterogeneity sort of challenge is probably like the biggest piece that we're grappling with and struggling with to some extent. So I remember someone, it was Vicky Entwistle, was a plenary speaker for us in our very first annual meeting. And the thing that she emphasized, one of the things that she emphasized was that we should never talk about the patient voice, with singular patient and singular voice. We should always talk about patients' voices, recognizing this very explicitly and transparently. But, you know, so yeah, I mean, I guess I'm just sort of sharing that this is a struggle we have. But I think like you linked representativeness and diversity together. And I'm sort of like ticking the diversity. We need to like recognize that and embrace that and like make sure that we're doing a much better job of that. I think the representativeness, we definitely shy away from calling patients patient representatives because it just seems like an unfair goal to be giving to a patient. So, I mean, is representativeness something that we should be even aspiring to?
I would say the reason that's up there is because I hear people say this is what we need.
Yeah.
It's that idea of, you know, the demographic, socio-demographic, you know, we one of these, one, you know, that, all of that.
Yeah.
That's just where people go.
Mm-hmm.
I would agree with you that it is, and I actually didn't say representation, I said representative. I would even push it further to say reflective of. Even in my own citizen deliberation work, we don't talk about representation and finding, you know, we talk about reflective of life stages, life experiences, you know, less about the age, education, ethnicity, et cetera. But there is some of that in there. I mean, you know that. I heard a little bit about that yesterday. Hard to reach. Well, how do you know that? There's an issue of who isn't being represented in some of your engagement work. That's how you're coming to this ideal of diversity. So they actually are kind of just different sides, different elements of it.
Thank you, Sterling. Thank you, Julia. Do we have other questions from those participating via WebEx?
Hi, Julia, it's Tom.
Oh, hi, Tom.
Just wanted to perhaps comment that it seems to me that we're moving towards a hierarchy of engagement, of levels of engagement, and it would appear certainly in the last few years that the word, at least of co-design, has continuously come up as some sort of sense of the top of that hierarchy. Do you want to unbundle that notion of what you think co-design is all about and its importance, and any thoughts you might have about it?
That's a great question. So I have a colleague at McMaster who, you know, just like I describe citizen deliberative public engagement as kind of my main method, go-to, those are the approaches I use. She is a co-design expert. And I chatted with her recently because I said, you know, I really want to understand this field, this method, you know, it's everywhere. And she said, well, it's everywhere, but it's not really, there's real co-design and then there's co-design. She said, what do you
Right.
want to learn about? So again, this is the politics of all of this, or the rush to say we're doing something that we think people think is the right thing to do, the labels. Man, this field has just been so rich for that. Again, as a kind of student of, analyst of, I could do, you know, beautiful kind of historical reflection on that. Consultation, bad word, right? Not really interacting, not collaborating, two different sides. But sometimes consultation is like the perfect thing to do for a particular issue. So Tom, I'm not going to, I actually can't tell you what, you know, real co-design is or what bad co-design is. I just hear people saying we have to use co-design. And there was an example recently, an organization I was working with who was very interested in doing some evaluation work, and they were stuck in a place, and it was because there was a feeling among the senior management in the organization they had to use co-design to do their evaluation. And I said, co-designing, in this case, I'm sorry, it just doesn't make sense, but it was the word, it was the label, it was use co-design, we have to use it. That is completely the wrong way around to this. So I don't know if that was the motivation for your question, Tom, but I have big concerns about it.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. And for those of you who don't know, that is Tom Noseworthy, the CEO of the Academic Health Science Network, who's in this office, just in another room. Thanks for participating, Tom, with your crew there. Others participating via WebEx, are there any questions from you?
Karen.
Sorry?
Alini is taking the mic. And Karen.
I think, Karen, are you wanting to ask a question? I think not. Anyone else? Are there any questions from in the room here in the boardroom of 420 West, 1367 West Broadway?
Well, there's a question. Chan.
So I'll read this question, which is from Aline Silva. Julia, thanks for your amazing presentation! Exclamation point. In Brazil, we have working close to patients' associations, but there's a worry about the potential conflict of interest related to pharma industry. I've seen that here in Canada, you prefer to work with individuals. So I'd like to know more about how have you dealt with potential conflict of interest?
Good. Well, first of all, not me at all, because it's the organizations we're talking about. I mean, I guess this is where I'm putting on my HTA hat, having done a fair bit of work in that area. And I would not say that it's only about working with individuals. Certainly, an organization like CADIS has a very clear rules, processes, policies, et cetera, around working with patient organizations. They have patient submission process, et cetera. And Lena, I know your field is HTA, so you may know this well yourself. But I would say that in the HTA realm, it's been more typical of working with organizations than individuals. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the new council changes or exerts some kind of influence on that. I don't know if it will. So that's how I would answer that question. I don't know if you want to go beyond HTA, but I know that's where you're working, so I'm not sure if that helps. Would there be another angle on that?
Well, I think it is interesting that in HTA it does tend to be with organizations because it tends to be the sort of pharma side of things, not necessarily exclusively, but on the health research side, actually, we have gone more on the individual focus, and we haven't had much engagement with patient associations as such, organized patient voices.
That's why I think it's so interesting to and potentially rich to think about different things and how they do things, right? I mean, I know there's so much to do and kind of so little time, but being open to just, wow, okay, what would it look like if we thought about engaging and partnering with organizations of patients as opposed to individuals?
Yeah. Thank you for the question. Are there any other questions from those participating via WebEx? Feel free to either unmute your microphone or use the chat function. We have a question from Colleen McGavin. Thanks, Julia. You obviously have a wealth of knowledge and experience to share. Another exclamation point. I wonder if you can comment on one person wearing more than one hat during an engagement, for instance, a clinician who also has a patient, who also has patient experience.
There's a good one. Well, so I would say to that one, of course, clinicians can have patient experiences. So if they're wanting to share that patient experience in some way, in some capacity, being very clear and very purposeful about what they're doing and transparent, right? That's key. They should never be speaking for patients. They are in a unique position in comparison to patients who do not have the clinical experience, expertise. Obviously, there's power dynamics in here. So I would want to explore this more with you, Colleen, and say what's going on here. Is it a concern that a clinician is trying to speak on behalf of patients, or just that they're sharing a patient experience? I assume that there's, a motivation. Why would they be sharing it if they're not trying to have some influence of some kind? I don't know. I'd have to hear a little bit more about the context around that one. But we have to recognize that we are in different roles, and you just need to be as clear and purposeful as you can be.
Colleen, did you want to augment some more information about what you're trying to get at there, or you could unmute yourself if you like?
It's a concern that's been expressed by a number of patients that I work with around people wearing more than one hat at a table and how difficult it is to bring more than one perspective to a particular engagement. So I just thought I would pose the question and see what Julia's thoughts were on that.
Yeah, years ago, when organizations were just starting into this area, you'd actually have examples of people, saying, "Oh, yeah, we have a patient voice. It's our retired physician who, decided that, they had an experience with the health system and wanted to then share that experience, and that's our patient representative." Obviously, that's problematic for a number of reasons, and I think we've pretty much moved on from there. I don't know. So I just think if this is coming from the patients, clearly there's some concern that the clinician is possibly trying to, again, I'm speculating completely, but perhaps they're trying to push out or away some other perspectives and trying to have their own be privileged in some way. I just don't know.
Thanks, Colleen, for clarifying. Any other questions from those via WebEx? Hearing none, I'm coming to the room here on West Broadway. Any questions, comments? I see Larry Mraz has his hand raised. Larry, please.
I have a question. Thank you for a great presentation. So the issues of co-bills, representation, and even this idea of wearing two hats, something that is found in the world of qualitative health research. So do you have any lessons or insights from the theory behind qualitative research that can be borrowed or used in our understandings in historian research?
Well, sure. I mean, participatory action research, community-based participatory research. I mean, those are all the principles behind that. Are working with community, not having them as research subjects, right? So sure, and that's come up in talks I've given, and just saying, is it the same thing? And I would say the principles definitely are the same thing. I don't know what learning, other than to go back to my previous comment to say, I think it's hugely important to be very clear at the outset about roles, right? It came up a little bit yesterday around issues, and I think that's perhaps where I've seen research teams, where they've fallen off a bit or had some struggles and bumps along the road. It's when they've rushed to bring patients on board and not really taken the time to very clearly establish, okay, let's have a discussion about your role on this research team. What are your expectations? What are our hopes, our expectations? Does it make sense for you to be involved at every step of the way? Again, these things take time, and it's easy for someone in my position kind of analyzing to say this is what you should do. It's incredibly difficult to do this on the ground, on the fly. I mean, I heard just a little bit about the constraints the structures are working in. If you're looking at compensation, well, do we want to put all of our, compensation hours into people completing, ethics modules? It is so, it's just so constrained. But I do think clear establishment of roles and recognition, and I would say the same thing around the compensation, right, is what are people's expectations? So it's usually that's when people fall off and have difficulty, is when they haven't been really clear and open at the beginning. But I don't know that qualitative research methods really help with that. The principles of community-based participatory research, for sure. The idea of with us, not to us. And that's all very intuitive to me, right? Lots of time, lots of discussion, and recognizing people don't necessarily work the same way we do in terms of time for meetings, right? All kinds of examples. Like 8 a.m. phone calls. I can't be up and functioning, but not me personally, but the patients, right? How can you expect me to be there, right? Do that. Like, that's just not going to happen. So there are just many, many examples that if you just thought about it for maybe 5-10 minutes even, and had a person whose job it is to kind of think about those things and work them through, it might be better. I don't know what I mean.
So thanks, Larry. We have one more question that's come via a WebEx participant. Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. Point. Widely in the involvement literature, and as you mentioned, there's a lack of diversity in terms of who gets involved in research. Can you please share your experience of involving diverse contributors, as we know that there is no one-size-fits-all approach in engagement? Thank you. I'll just point out that we're at 1 minute past the hour. If you need to leave the webinar, please feel free to. We did start a minute or two past, so I think we're okay for another couple of minutes.
Yeah, it's a tough one to answer quickly. I would say that I haven't done particularly well. I mean, for me, it's okay. What is the topic? Again, what are we trying to achieve here? Who do we feel are affected parties? Right? That's often what I talk about. Who's affected by this? If it's a policy decision, we're looking for input or partnering, whatever. Who's most affected by this? And who do we need to have at the table? Not who wants to be here and who will push to be here, but who do we actually think needs to be here? Who will be affected by whatever the outcome is? That's really a very generic way that I've approached it. And that's probably the best way, most efficient way I can answer it.
Thank you. You did that in under a minute. Well done. Thank you very much. On behalf of the support unit, on behalf of our leadership, I'd like to thank you very much for coming today and for an excellent webinar. For those of you participating via WebEx, it has been recorded and it will be up on our website soon, and you can share that with your colleagues and your network. So thanks very much for tuning in to our webinar today, and all the best. And thanks, Julia. Thanks. Great job there, Pat. Really good. She's very good. Especially